if the RSF does take over it and I don't know if they've learned from their mistakes or not, but if they don't, then you're going to see another sort of ethnic cleansing.
Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the foreign policy and global development communities and anyone who wants a deeper understanding of what is driving events in the world today. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg. I am a veteran international affairs journalist and the editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. A genocidal militia called the Rapid Support Forces has been laying siege to the city of Fasher in Darfur for nearly 500 days. But in recent weeks, the situation has sharply deteriorated. Some 250,000 people are now trapped in the city and are enduring relentless bombardment from drones and artillery. Food is scarce, and an unknown number of people are starving to death. To make matters worse, recent moves by the Rapid Support Forces suggest that they may be preparing for a major all-out assault on the city. This is a pivotal moment in Sudan's civil war. After 2.5 years of fighting, the Sudanese Armed Forces control most of the country's east, including Khartoum. The Rapid Support Forces, meanwhile, hold much of the west of the country, including resource-rich Darfur, with the critical exception of Fasher. Joining me to discuss this precarious moment in Sudan's war and what might finally bring an end to the conflict is Nouman El-Walid Musa. He's a PhD student in political science at the University of California, Los Angeles, who studies civil wars in Africa. We begin by discussing the situation on the ground in Fasher and then have a broader conversation about what the battle for Fasher means for the future of Sudan. We recorded our conversation live via Substack. If you'd like to join one of these live recordings, please visit globaldispatches.org. While you're there, you can upgrade to a paid subscription to support my ability to bring you conversations like this on undercovered global stories with frequency and determination. Thank you. I appreciate your support. Now here is my conversation with Nouman El-Walid Musa. So Nouman, I wanted to kick it off to you to have you kind of situate Fasher both geographically and also politically in terms of the conflict in Sudan today.
So Fasher is the capital of Darfur historically. It's what, even prior to colonization, or like the sultans of Darfur ruled from. But in terms of our current conflict, it's very important for one specific reason. The Rapid Support Forces has been able to control most of Darfur, except for that city.
And I should just say the two rival militaries that are vying for control of Sudan are the Sudanese Armed Forces, which now control most of the east, and the Rapid Support Forces, the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces.
Yeah, when the war erupted, unlike usual conflicts in most of Africa, they start in the peripheral regions or regions outside of the capital. This war started off in the capital in Khartoum, and the Rapid Support Forces were able to control most of it for 2 years. But for the past year, the army has been able to gain more territory that it has lost in the past 2 years, and has pushed the RSF back towards Western Sudan. And when I say back to, what I'm referring to is that the Rapid Support Forces gain most of their support in terms of tribal support, military support, all sorts of support in Western Sudan. So Western Sudan is their stronghold. However, when the war started, they were able to control Darfur in the first few months. It was an easy job. So even some cities were captured without much fighting, except Fasher. I think part of this is that other rebel groups, namely the Justice and Equality Movement and the Sudan Liberation Army led by Mini Minawi, those have had support there. So it was a contested area, I would say, for the first few months of the war. It was neutral. But then once coalitions and alliances started to be shaped, it became a key battleground. The issue, and as most wars, it hasn't been a decisive battle at all. More than 200 battles have been fought in Al-Fashir as of now. And this is a city where the population is north of 250,000. And in addition to that, when fighting started in other parts of the country, especially western part of Sudan, a lot of refugees sought shelter in Al-Fashir. So you have the residents as well as other refugees. But the RSF hasn't been able to capture it for the past 2 years. More than 200 battles have been fought. And you have basically a huge besieging of the city. The main issue is, of course, the civilian death. And secondary, people who want to leave can't leave. And you want to leave, you basically have to pay exorbitant amounts of money to RSF soldiers around the city to get out.
I've seen so many horror stories. Actually, just last night, BBC ran a really powerful piece on exactly the issue that you just cited, that you have, north of 250,000 people trapped in this city. There is a way out, but as you said, the way out involves paying exorbitant bribes while also putting yourself at risk to banditry on the road, to murder on the road, to just being killed by the RSF fighters that you've paid a bribe to. So it's like an uncertain escape for sure.
And I think that's the key problem. But if I were to look at Al-Fashir, I think it's a symptom of a much larger issue going on in Sudan right now. Namely, it's the issue of the war itself. And secondly, I read a while back that in terms of military strategy, it may seem that the army is using Al-Fashir as a battleground to have the RSF basically concentrate most of their manpower and decrease their effectiveness on other battlegrounds. Even, I think, one of the resistance committees within Al-Fashir released a statement recently calling out the army to not use Al-Fashir to basically
the flytrap theory, I suppose. Meanwhile, you have 250,000 people who are starving to death inside this city because it's being, surrounded on all sides and increasingly bombarded. I mean, it looks as if in recent weeks, the RSF, or even like in recent days, is seeking to mount a major offensive in this city. Is that something that you're seeing as well?
Yeah, I think the Yale Humanitarian Research Lab released a couple of satellite images showing that actually there are a lot of drones being prepared to launch an attack on Al-Fashir. But more importantly, today, I think the army was, for the first time in since April, has been able to conduct successful aerial attacks above Al-Fashir. I don't know what the specific reasons are for the lack of its aerial attacks, but part of it is that the RSF has been able to install a lot of anti-aircraft equipment. And that just tells you how sophisticated the arms are in this current conflict.
Yeah. Well, we'll get to that point because that is a very crucial part of this conversation is how there has been an increase in the sophistication of the weapons that are being used to fight this war, particularly on the part of the RSF. The Washington Post just wrote an incredible investigation on that recently, which I want to get into in a second. But I just do want to convey how volatile this situation around Al-Fashir is, in particular because there is this genocidal ethnic element of this conflict as well. We've seen the toppling of other cities by the RSF in Darfur result into widespread mass atrocity events in which the RSF have unleashed fury against supposed ethnic rivals. Could you just kind of describe the ethnic element of this situation and why so far, there have been a lot of credible claims of genocide, including by the U.S. government and many international humanitarian organizations and human rights organizations as well?
I think that's a very important point. And in order to understand the ethnic element, we need to go back to the early 2000s where the earlier conflicts in Darfur started, right?
Yeah, I call it the first Darfur genocide.
Yeah. And the key actors have shuffled their positions, pretty much the same people, but taking different sides. But when you're looking at the conflict, I think it's very important to understand where most of these fighters are recruiting from. The RSF has heavily depended on Arab nomadic groups. In addition, I think there's other groups that are involved. And when I'm saying Arab here, it's in the local Sudanese context, where, especially in Darfur, the two main cleavages of ethnic groups are like between Arab and non-Arab or African. And so when the war started, especially
Yeah.
the Jiniana issue and that massacre that happened there were already existing bombs of previous grievances and issues that existed. And so most of these fighters are not properly trained. And so once they were able to gain an upper hand and within these cities, they unleashed a lot of atrocities. And I think that's what a lot of people are worried about in Al-Fashir right now, is that if the RSF does take over it and I don't know if they've learned from their mistakes or not, but if they don't, then you're going to see another sort of ethnic cleansing. And Al-Fashir is very diverse. And I think what I've heard is that even within the RSF troops, there's more of a heterogeneous element to in terms of the recruiting and the fighters. Given that this isn't their usual tribal base, the RSF had to seek assistance from other groups that are like locally based to fight this territory.
So we earlier mentioned the growing sophistication of the weaponry being used in this war, particularly by the rapid support forces. I don't even call it like an open secret, but there has been much documentation in media and other kind of official sources that the United Arab Emirates is the one who is supplying the RSF with the weapons that it needs to prosecute this war. Yet at the same time, just was it like a few weeks ago, the United Arab Emirates, as part of the so-called Quad of countries, called for like a ceasefire and for countries to stop arming all sides of this war. Can you just kind of briefly explain to listeners the external dynamics that are driving this conflict?
I think before the foreign interference in the conflict, which we know now who the key actors are, who they're supporting, when people hear of a civil war, the thing that comes to mind is it's a central government versus a rebel group that's like based in some sort of preferential. What's very unique about Sudan's conflict is that the origins of this war is that you basically had a infighting between the security forces because the rapid support forces were established by the government, armed by the government, gained more power by the government, all of it. So they already had an advantage that not any rebel group would have in any part of the country because you were probably part of the state. Going to the Quad, I think the important part that's happening here is that according to their statement, especially in the more past recent weeks, there's been more and more meetings and initiatives being taken place by the U.S. Special Envoy. And I think it's good in the sense that in order to end a civil conflict or most civil conflicts, you must negotiate between the foreign backers. What's kind of surprising is that the Rapid Support Forces recently supported the Quad statement.
And just briefly, the Quad is the UAE, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the United States. And Egypt supports the Sudanese Armed Forces. UAE supports the RSF, even though they deny it. Saudi Arabia more or less supports UAE. Is that right?
Saudi Arabia's position is not quite clear because they've hosted
The Jeddah, yeah.
May 2023. On a similar note, Professor Alden Young and I wrote a piece a while back talking about why we see, especially in the first year in the war, a lot of actors were very impartial to the conflict. And this stems from how they view the conflict. More importantly, a lot of actors have been very regional, especially have been very frustrated with the tenure of Omar al-Bashir. So he ruled from 1989 to 2019 when he was toppled. And so they see the Sudanese Armed Forces as a continuation of his policies. So that's why for the first while, not a lot of states were actually supporting one side or the other. But the recent statement, I think what's good about it is that it basically wants to dismantle the old system. They refer to it as the Muslim Brotherhood. But I think when Muslim Brotherhood is mentioned, an ideological component comes to mind. And I think it's a more nuanced term because you do end up having a lot of Islamist parties technically that are against or were against the system. However, when in the local context they're referring to the Muslim Brotherhood, you're more referring to Umar al-Bashir's like political apparatus per se.
Mhm.
But what's kind of astonishing is that the leader of the army came, maybe it's not surprising, he came out in a meeting in Doha with a bunch of Sudanese diaspora and said that he doesn't abide with what the Quad said. And for me, I think that's a bit surprising and it might impact SAF's standing because I would expect, given their gains the past few years, they would actually come down and come and join peace talks. But however, they've been refusing. And so the reluctance from the Sudanese army to kind of cooperate with the international community is a bit troubling because then even those who back you might end up reducing their support given that you can't deliver to what they're actually looking for.
Well, I mean, that at least to me has seemed to be like one of the fundamental problems of this conflict from the outset is that the warring parties, the head of the RSF and the head of the SAF, the Sudanese Armed Forces, continue to find more to gain through fighting than through a cessation of hostilities or peace talks. And there hasn't been at least sufficient pressure to bear on either party to convince them that there is more to gain through peace talks than through fighting.
Yeah, I think definitely. But in terms of, I think in the long run, from an institutional perspective, the RSF has a lot more to gain from peace talks than the SAF. The SAF still maintains international sovereignty, meaning that it can gain more support. All the
Yeah, like they're the ones speaking at the UN.
and domestically, they have still like basic bureaucratic institutions that are run by them. However, the RSF has more to gain in the sense that if they come to peace talks, they establish themselves in a permanent political system. Even prior to the war, they weren't well established. They kind of operated as a parallel government as opposed to being part and parcel of the central government.
So, obviously we don't know what's going to happen in El Fasher, but it's looking increasingly likely that the country is kind of split down the middle a little bit, right? With the Sudanese Armed Forces controlling the capital, Khartoum, the main port of Sudan, and most of the east of the country, with the Rapid Support Forces controlling most of the west of the country, is like a de facto partition of Sudan absent a formal peace deal. Like, an acceptable outcome here, do you think, in terms of what can be done to just stop the fighting?
I think that's what we hope for because the war's been going on for more than 2 years now. You have a third of the population displaced. So anything that would put an ending to fighting, I think would be a great outcome. However, I think the problem is when you think about Western Sudan and Eastern Sudan, they're not homogenous blocks. And even if fighting does calm down between the rapid support forces and the Sudanese armed forces, there's a higher chance that you might actually have infighting between them. Because when you talk about Al-Fashir is important not only in terms of geographical territory, but most of the people or troops fighting are the ex-rebel groups, and now they're like a new paramilitary group with the army. And if Al-Fashir is taken over by the RSF, they lose their leverage vis-a-vis the central government. And I think viewers would be surprised to know that an ex-rebel leader, now pro-government, Dr. Jibril Ibrahim is the Minister of Finance. And so he's not getting that position because of what he's offering. I think that if Fasher is lost, then Burhan would probably not need them as much as he does right now.
So I guess number one, like we are on the precipice of a massive humanitarian crisis that is unfolding right now in El Fasher, turning into an all-out calamity. What can be done to prevent that outcome? And number two, more broadly, what can key players in the international community do to just, if not like impose a ceasefire, at least reduce like the levels of violence unfolding in Sudan today?
Yeah, I think primarily you need more engagement with both actors. I don't know to what extent the international community is communicating, but I know, for instance, it's very difficult for the rapid support forces to actually present what their argument is in a lot of like capitals of the world. Secondly, I think you need more advocates in terms of humanitarian role. And I think this goes back to what the political elite in Sudan are concerned about. Since the war has started, we still don't have a single cohesive body that is advocating or pushing for sole humanitarian causes only. Most of the focus has been political, but even political, it's been very polarized. And so you don't hear a lot of voices just coming together to talk about the humanitarian issue. And if I'm not mistaken, both parties to the conflict have been able to cooperate on issues related to the oil pipeline coming out of South Sudan. The humanitarian component is not something that they are concerned about. Or, on the other hand, they're using it as a weapon against the other side. But I think the Quad statement did talk a lot about humanitarian aid, but there hasn't been as much pressure to do that. In compared to what's happening in other conflicts in the world, Sudan's conflict has quietly been overlooked by international actors.
On that question of like leveraging humanitarian aid and cooperation as like a way to potentially kind of open the door for broader political talks, I'm wondering how you see the emergency response rooms kind of fit into that dynamic that you just described. So, for listeners who are unaware, these are essentially like mutual aid societies in various parts of Sudan that have kind of sprung up in the context of this humanitarian crisis to create like soup kitchens or little medical centers or anything that like the community needs to survive. These organic groups that together are called the emergency response rooms are propping up like what's basically left of civic space in Sudan today as a way to just manage the humanitarian fallout of this conflict. Is there like a better way that the international community can bypass these vainglorious generals and support more directly these on the ground emergency response rooms and support humanitarian aid more directly to people that are in need right now?
A lot of entities, namely the UN, are attempting to bypass most state or even non-state actors, warring parties, to help distribute aid via merchants in like local cities. A lot of medical institutions, I know, for instance, like the Sudanese American Professionals Association here in the United States, they've been successful in working with these emergency rooms. And I think they have been more successful in providing to those people impacted on the ground. But I think this is still like a band-aid to the conflict. Like if you don't at least lead to a ceasefire, the amount of aid you're going to be able to provide is quite limited. More importantly, you have a prime minister in Port Sudan who denies any famine that happening in Sudan. And so if you're denying famine, how are you going to expect the international donors to actually help you alleviate the suffering?
Norman, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time and for your insights.
Thank you very much, Mark.
Thanks for listening to Global Dispatches. The show is produced by me, Mark Leon Goldberg. It is edited and mixed by Levi Sharp. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, make sure to follow the show and enable automatic downloads to get new episodes as soon as they're released. On Spotify, tap the bell icon to get a notification when we publish new episodes. And of course, please visit globaldispatches.org to get on our free mailing list, get in touch with me, and access our full archive. Thank you.